there. Meantime, some news about the plans for the president. The New York Times saying the Biden's toasted 2024 campaign with Macron at the state dinner. It was a lighthearted moment. Mr. Biden still intends to make a formal decision about whether he will run again after the holiday season. But the fact that the Bidens were willing to signal to an important foreign ally about the president's plans hints at how committed they are to a second term. And the 80-year-old president, we're told, his family is behind that possible run. Let's bring in our panel. Fox News senior political analyst Britt Hume, Leslie Marshall, Democratic strategist, and Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner. You know, the juxtaposition, Britt, of those two things was to show that this president just finished probably one of the most successful midterm campaigns of any president in many, many years. He appears ready to run again, and yet the situation at the southern border appears to be getting worse, and there wasn't really any distinguishable payback by voters for that.
Yeah, he seems to have gotten by with his failure to take care that the laws governing the border be faithfully executed as the Constitution requires him to do. And as long as that's the case, there are a couple of things seem likely. One is he's not going to go to the border. You know, he's going down there, I guess, this week, but he's not going to visit the border because he didn't want to call attention to the lawlessness down there. And of course, I think, you know, his success, if you want to call it that, in the midterms has emboldened him, and he wants to run again. You can look at, if you're a Democrat, you can look at that in two ways. You can say, well, we had good news in the midterms. The bad news is that this senile 80-year-old man who, you know, not so very long ago was ruled to be too far gone to make another campaign is going to run again. Remarkable.
Leslie, how do you see it? And, you know, coming off of the midterms and the win from Raphael Warnock just last night in that runoff.
Well, I don't think it's since the midterms that the president wanted to and decided to and had the family backing him to run a second term. I think most people who get into this game, whether it's in the House for 2 years, in the Senate for 6, or the presidency, are looking for 8. And I don't think Joe Biden is any exception. I think the reason that we have this conversation is because there are Democrats out there that have whispered, you know, he shouldn't be our candidate. There are people concerned, especially on my side of the aisle, when they've seen the poll numbers. And some of those people have backed off from those conversations behind closed doors that were gathering after the midterms, after Warnock. And obviously, like you said, Brett, a very successful midterm for the president, especially when you look at his ratings as of late.
Yeah, Byron, meantime, on Capitol Hill, they're trying to get a national defense authorization bill, a defense bill through, a funding of the government, and there are some hiccups. Some Republicans say, wait, why do we want to do this? Because we now have control of the House as of January 3rd of next year. Why not use the leverage? Here's the House Minority Leader currently trying to be House Speaker. Take a listen.
We're 28 days away from Republicans having the gavel. We would be stronger in every negotiation. So any Republican that's out there trying to work with them is wrong.
What about that, Byron? I mean, because there are some Republicans trying to get it across the finish line.
Indeed. Listen, I think what McCarthy's saying makes a lot of sense. We know for a fact Republicans are going to be in charge next month. And I think that his logic is probably going to prevail. We've heard Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, say it looks like they're going to have to do some sort of temporary spending bill rather than a giant year-long spending measure. The bigger question being, of course, can Kevin McCarthy get elected Speaker when the time comes? And we still have about 5 Republicans saying they're not going to vote for him, some of them with very procedural objections to Kevin McCarthy, and it's not clear whether under intensifying pressure to get in line and vote for the Speaker because they don't have many votes to spare, whether they will finally cave and vote for him on January 3rd.
Britt, it's processy, but I was just out at the Reagan Defense Forum at the Reagan Library, and there are a bunch of not only defense officials in the Pentagon and elsewhere, but businesses that do long-term planning based on what has been negotiated on this NDAA. So they would like to see it passed instead of a short-term continuing resolution that may punt down the road all of that. Does that factor into this? How do you think this shakes out as we approach another fiscal cliff here?
Well, I think most of the things that the defense people would think are necessary and good in that bill would be in any bill that would be passed after the first of the year when the new Republican House is seated. So I'm not sure that I don't think this is a now or never proposition on the measures that they're concerned about. Obviously, there's been a depletion of our weapons stocks in our efforts to help Ukraine. I think that there'd be widespread bipartisan support for replenishing those stocks, and I think that would carry over into the new Congress. I just cite that as one example of the kinds of things that are in that bill.
Yeah, and Leslie, if that can't get through, the defense stuff and the funding of the government, the efforts by Senators Tom Tillis and Kyrsten Sinema to come up with some negotiation on immigration and the future of dreamers in this lame duck session seems a bit pie in the sky.
It does, but you know what? I think, it's terrible to hear if they're going to work with them, because what I think the midterms have shown us, if anything, especially when you have split-ticket voters in many states, is that the American people want Democrats and Republicans to work together to get things done in the best interest of this nation and the American people. So I don't think you just wait for a very slim majority coming up in a couple of months.
Trying to see common ground. All right, panel, stand by.
I can't speak to decisions made by the campaign. It's up to these companies to make their own decision about the content on their platforms and to ensure content follows their own standards and policies.
This Twitter story continues to get more strange. Now the chief counsel, the lawyer for Twitter, has been fired. Elon Musk tweeting out, in light of concerns about James Baker's possible role in suppression of information important to the public dialogue, he was exited from Twitter today. Who is James Baker? Well, a New York Post column by Jonathan Turley, and now appears that most of the figures and institutions involved in Russian collusion claims are within 6 degrees of James Baker. Not only did Baker work closely with fired FBI Director James Comey and other key figures at the Justice Department, but he was an acquaintance of key Clinton figures like Sussman, who pushed the false collusion allegations. He was also hired by Brookings Institution, which also had a curious Bacon-like role in the origins and development of the false Russian collusion allegations. Back with the panel. Britt, we'll talk about the substance here in a second, but the coverage of this is really bizarre. The media covered the former president's statements about the Twitter file release and the controversial statement of suspension of the Constitution because he feels like the election was a fraud, and all the reaction to that. But they didn't cover the substance of what's coming out throughout all of these releases. It's really quite something to watch.
Yeah, I agree with that, Brett. It is something to watch, and it's typical of our modern mainstream media today that this is how they behave. When the Hunter Biden laptop story broke in the New York Post, there was really no reason to believe it was anything other than on the up and up. As it turned out, indeed it was. Mainstream media outlets by the bushel refused to touch it. Twitter shut it down on their site, of what they've later acknowledged was a mistake. But then comes the revelations about what went into the decision to shut it down. They're not covering that either. So, you'd think that they would think that people would notice, and I guess some people do, but in this atmosphere, they never seem to learn, they never seem to do the right thing, because they do the wrong thing over and over.
Byron, we can all argue about what it would have meant to the 2020 election had the Hunter Biden story been allowed to flourish and been covered by mainstream media and go back and relive that moment. And we can all say that the controversial comments by the former president obviously ignited all kinds of even Republican and Trump supporter reaction to them. But the fact that James Baker is a central figure here in all of these things, as Jonathan Turley pointed out, is number one, fascinating, and number two, troubling on some level, right?
It is, and what's amazing about this is the quickness with which this Hunter Biden story, the Hunter Biden Twitter story, is becoming an FBI story. And it's not just in the disclosures that are coming from Elon Musk. In a completely separate case, a man named Yoel Roth, who was Twitter's chief censor, actually made a legal declaration saying that he had met with FBI officials and other national security officials weekly in the run-up to the the 2020 election, and that they warned him about the possible dump of foreign disinformation that might target Hunter Biden. So, New York Post publishes entirely legitimate story about Hunter Biden, and Twitter goes, wow, that must be what they talked about, and censors the story. Now, we've learned already that a lot of the officials at Twitter back then were very eager to censor viewpoints that they did not agree with. On the other hand, they didn't come up with this warning saying about you might get disinformation and it might target Hunter Biden. That came from the FBI, and we need to learn a lot more about this connection. James Baker is kind of a physical manifestation of a connection between Twitter and the FBI.
There's a lot to talk about here, and we'll talk about more of it. James Baker is the Deputy General Counsel for Twitter and is alleged to have gone through some of the release just the other night, Leslie. But there are many good men and women at the FBI, but the leadership there and the tie to all of this is very bizarre.
No, it is bizarre, and the media should have covered it back then, and the media should cover it now. But here's something I want covered, and former Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey said what I was thinking. Release it all. You want full transparency, Elon Musk? Let all of us see and decide for ourselves, because if you're only releasing snippets and edited versions, then we don't know the whole story, and everyone deserves to know the whole story and the truth.
You know, Jack Dorsey could have done that, too, when he was the CEO.
Yep, sure.
But you're right. Okay, thank you all.